Well, it's time to get started, so let's go ahead and start our study tonight. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, today, again, we are so privileged to come into your presence, to open your word, and to see what you have for us tonight. I pray you will anoint your word as it goes out, anoint my lips to say those things that you have, anoint our hearts to receive, and God, let there be something in this that will make a difference in our lives. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, tonight this will be a fairly short lesson, I think. And the reason is because next week we have it starts off with a really long reading and a lot of stuff. So if I tried to put the two tonight, we'd be here for about 3 hours. So I figured we'll cut it short a little bit tonight and then pick up next week. So tonight, we are continuing a fourth ministry, or period 4, the ministry to the 12 disciples. This is where Jesus is primarily teaching his 12 disciples. And we've just finished the second journey across the Sea of Galilee. He's fed the 5,000 last week, and all of that miraculous stuff that went on there. And so now today we're going to pick that up right after the feeding of the 5,000. So we pick it up with dispelling the multitude and Jesus' retirement to prayer. So we start in Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when the evening came, he was alone there. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 and 46, he covers it this way. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he sent while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now John, chapter 6, verse 14 and 17. Now remember, John, his writing is primarily for the purpose of showing the deity of Christ. While Matthew covers the idea he was a Jew and looks at it from that perspective, Mark is looking at it more from a Gentile or a general view. So along comes John, and his account of this is somewhat different from the others, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He starts off in John chapter 6, verse 14. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea towards Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. So, we've just had this wonderful experience of Jesus breaking the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and feeding 5,000. And we talked about how, after they had fed the 5,000, there were 12 baskets full. And I mentioned the basket was a little thing they carried with them. And I didn't think about it till I was thinking about it today, in fact. When I was in the Philippines, they gave me that backpack out of, that was woven. Mm-hmm. That was the type of basket that they used. It was one they could throw over their shoulder and fill it with provisions. So it was probably about that size. If I had already thought about it earlier, I would have brought that. Mm-hmm. But it's so big, and throw it like a little backpack on your back. And so each of the disciples had a quantity sufficient, more than sufficient, for them to eat. Because you'll remember, they had been out on their practice journeys, they had come back, they talked to Jesus, they reported to him, and the scripture says, as we read last week, that they didn't even have time to eat because it was so busy. So they jumped in the boat and went over to Bethsaida, which was a desolate place. And when they got there, there's the multitude. And so Jesus taught, Jesus fed the 5,000. This went on for the whole day. And so they had not eaten themselves. Even though the 5,000 had been fed, they still hadn't eaten anything. And no telling how long before since they had eaten. And so the idea here is that when we allow Jesus to work, and when we serve Him, and when we stop worrying about ourselves, and because remember Jesus, when He sent them out, He said, don't take food with you, don't take clothes, don't take anything with you. I'm going to supply it all. They found out He supplied their needs. Then they get over there, they're hungry, everybody's hungry, but they take the time to feed the multitudes. And what did God do? He provided for them abundantly more than they needed for their needs at that time. Each of them had a basket of food. Now, immediately after this, you tie the two together, fed the 5,000, picked up the 12 baskets, and immediately Jesus made, it says, another word that's in there is He constrained them. He forced them. The idea you hear behind the Greek is they didn't want to go. It was getting dark, and Jesus said, no, you go get in the boat and you head for Capernaum. Head that direction. Now, I might point out, Mark said they went to Bethsaida. And there are similar commentaries, well, they must have been over to Bethsaida to wait for Him to come down and get in the boat. No, there was a Bethsaida. That was Bethsaida of Galilee. And we find that in, where's my reference? John has a reference to Bethsaida of Galilee, and I don't see it on here right at the moment. But we'll pick it up in a minute. What's that?
John 12:21.
John 12:21. Okay, yes. That's where it's at. Well, we can look that up if you'd like. John 12:21. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So the Bethsaida that they were at was not in Galilee. It was on the other side. It was in Decapolis. So there were two Bethsaidas. And that's how we get this. So when it says, Mark was specific in saying they were going to Bethsaida, and Matthew, or rather John, says that they were heading towards Capernaum. So that direction would be the same across the lake. So we have this mighty miracle. Jesus immediately tells them to get in the boat. Well, we might wonder why He would immediately tell them to get in the boat. You think, well, they would socialize, fellowship a little, or, whatever. But John gives us the reason why He made them immediately go to the boat. And that was that these men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did say, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take Him by force to make Him king. You got to kind of picture this in your mind. Now, you got 5,000 men, plus women and children, they're on the grass, and all of a sudden they say, hey, somebody starts it. Hey, this must be the Messiah. Yeah, this is the king. Yeah, and you can just see them pumping each other up. You watch a football game, and the Seahawks are on tonight. And if we were watching it, there's somebody up there pumping, and all of a sudden the crowd gets into it, and they're all excited about the football game. Well, this was happening here. They recognized Him to be something more than just a traveling rabbi. They said, oh, this must be the prophet. Now what they meant by that was this must be the Messiah. Their concept of Messiah for the average person was not that He was God. It was that He was the anointed prophet. And He would be a prophet, not so much God. They didn't make that connection between Messiah being God You know, it was a different concept. He was to be their coming king. He was going to be another David. He was going to bring Israel back to its glory days. And of course, at this time, people were anxious to get out from underneath the rule of Rome. And so they were all excited about getting a rebellion going, naming this guy as king. I mean, after all, if he can feed 5,000, if he can calm the storm, if he can do these things, he can defeat Rome. And so they were ready to go. And here's his 12 disciples, you know, with their little baskets of food. Jesus wanted them out of there. He did not want them involved in political decision making as it was in those days. They still did not recognize who he was, and we're going to see that in a few minutes. They knew he was mighty. They knew he was a prophet. They knew he was a teacher, but they had not made the connection between divinity and him at this point. And he had not expounded that to them. Remember, we're talking now about teaching the disciples. That's what this whole section is about. The feeding of the 5,000 was not meant to teach the 5,000. It was meant to teach his disciples something. And so here they are, and he sends them off. He says, you go get on the boat, you go in front of me. Now, according to John here, it looks like they got into the boat and waited a little bit. Now, it's kind of deceptive. You might think, well, you know, they waited until evening. It was already evening, because before he fed the 5,000, they came to him and said, it's evening, and they haven't eaten yet. So what really is meant here is it was almost dark when they got in the boat. And maybe they hesitated a little. Maybe Jesus is going to come. You know, maybe he'll come down and jump in the boat with us. But if he doesn't come, we're going to go. How's he going to get home? You know, he's going to have to walk all the way around that lake. So I don't know what their conversation was, but I know that he sent them away. And it says, when Jesus perceived that they were about to take him by force, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, it says, the other two, well, he sent the multitudes away, and John says he just went to the mountain. How did he send the multitudes away? I mean, here they are, ready to make him king. This is almost a riot going on. You know, everybody's, yeah, they're getting all excited about, and they're going to take him, make him king whether he likes it or not. And he just walks away. Now, this wasn't the first time Jesus had done this. You remember that, well, I don't think we've got to it yet, but they were going to come and take him out and kill him. Remember, the crowd was going to, and the Bible says he just walked through the midst of them and walked away. Now, some people say, well, he became invisible. I've heard that theory. I've heard all kinds of things. But really, if you put yourself in that place with probably 12,000 people with kids, women and kids, 12, you know, that's a lot of people, 12,000 people. They're all excited. They're all, you know, yeah, we're going to do this. They're jumping around. Yeah. Jesus is over there. Yeah, we're going to make him. Come on, let's go get him. Let's go get him. And while they're all getting everybody fired up, what's Jesus do? I'm out of here. And he just walked away. And once he walked away and went up to the mountain, what happened to the crowd? Yeah. Where's Jesus? He's gone. Oh, and we're going to find out later. He must have got down in the boats with those disciples, even though I heard him tell the disciples to leave him before him and go on. He must have run down there and jumped in one of those boats. Where was he? And they left. So Jesus didn't actively say, okay, dinner's over, turn off the lights, we're leaving. No, he just walked away. You see, when Jesus leaves, there's no other reason to stay there. If Jesus isn't there, you don't want to be there. There was no reason for them to stand around in a deserted place because Jesus wasn't there anymore. There's a lesson in that. If Jesus isn't in our midst, why are we there? We better get Jesus in our midst. But if we're trying to make Jesus something he is not or does not want to be, he'll not be in our midst. Now there's a deep thought there in that one. Too many people want Jesus to be the king of their lives. And that sounds good on the outside, except what they're talking about is, I want Jesus to provide for me. I want Jesus to give me everything. You know, I want Jesus to be my conqueror, my supporter, my protection. I want him to give me all of these things. But I don't want him to be the Lord of my life. There's a difference between being a king and a Lord. If he's the king, that just means he's got the authority. But if he's the Lord, that means he is my master. And there's a difference between being your master and being your king. You don't have a choice about a king, but you have a choice about a master. And you see, when Jesus, when he perceived that they weren't interested in what he was teaching, they only wanted the miracles and the food, and we'll see that later in a minute too. They only wanted a king to give them security, a king who would provide for them, a king who would make their lives so easy. When he perceived that, he went up on the mountain alone to pray. The desire of the people was to crown him king. But Jesus was not ready to be king, crowned king. Now they knew a mighty prophet would come and deliver them and become their king. And they recognized Jesus as that prophet. But Jesus, when we look at him, he's wandering around, an itinerant preacher. And you know, we look at the multitudes, but that must have been hard, traveling from city to city to city, preaching, teaching all day long. It had to be physically exhausting and tiring. And when they came to us, we're going to make you king. Yeah, we want you to be king. That had to be a temptation to the flesh of Jesus. Because he was God, but he was also man. He was divine, and yet he was flesh. And that flesh portion had to have been tempted. After all, one of the temptations that the devil threw at him in the wilderness was, if you'll just bow down and worship me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. I got news for you. He already has. But you see, if Jesus had said, okay, I'm your Messiah, let's go, I'll be your king, salvation would not have been provided for all mankind. Yeah, Israel probably would have risen to the heights that they were looking for, but who would still be the ruler of the world? You see, the main thing here is that Jesus would not have conquered death, hell, and the grave. They would still be under the control of Satan. So it was imperative that Jesus stand against this temptation. And we have a lesson here. When we are tempted, the best thing to do is to find some place alone and talk to God about it. When we find a place to pray, when we're tempted, when we go to prayer, notice he didn't have his disciples go and help him. Now in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked his disciples to give him a hand, help him pray. And they fell asleep. But Jesus here says, I'm going to go by myself up to the mountain and pray. You say, wait a minute, why did Jesus pray? He's God. Well, he prayed himself. You know, it doesn't make sense, our logical minds, why he would do that. But you remember there was flesh and there was divinity. That flesh, if it was impossible for the flesh of Jesus to have ever sinned or gone against the will of God, he would not be flesh. We forget that. You know, we put Jesus out here as divine, which he is, but we forget that he was just as flesh and blood as we are. He was tempted just as we are, the Bible says. You cannot be tempted unless you can fail. If you can't fail, you can't be tempted. That's why God cannot be tempted. He can't fail. But the flesh could fail. And he needed divine help to stand against temptation. Just as we do. He was our perfect example. Now, the disciples who went out and got in the boat, they probably waited to see if he would follow. Finally, it got dark, and we got to get out of here. So they started on their journey. And they probably assumed that Jesus would walk around the lake and meet them in the morning, or perhaps he would take another boat across, probably early in the morning. Probably not at night. But Jesus remained alone on the mountain. And this is interesting. He was praying and watching the disciples in their boat. He wasn't with them, but he was still concerned for them. Now the question arises, is if it was already dark, so how did Jesus see them? That's a little question to twist your mind up a little. He's up on the mountain, he's praying, and while he's praying, he's watching, keeping an eye out. You see, Jesus is the world's best multitasker. He can pray, he can intercede, and he can watch each and every one of us all at the same time. Whoa. That's what you call omnipotent. He can do anything at any time for anyone. He never loses track. He knows exactly where everybody is. He knows exactly what everybody is going through. He doesn't just see you as having a problem. He knows the problem, and he also knows the answer to the problem. And so here he was. It's already dark. We see Jesus watching and praying. Now, got the heading here. Jesus walks toward Capernaum on the sea. I really like this. Matthew chapter 14, verse 24 to 33. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God. Mark chapter 6, verses 47 to 52. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up in the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. And then John chapter 6, verses 18 to 21. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing it. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, It is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Something in this story we haven't seen before, right? Or at least haven't paid a lot of attention to. You see, when you put them all together and kind of read the 3 different accounts, you start to understand a little bit about what was going on. So we have the disciples. They've gotten into their little boat, well, a bigger boat actually, a pretty good size, and they headed out toward Capernaum. Now they set out after dark, so it had to be about 6 o'clock at night. This is what scholars say. They figure it was about 6 o'clock at night when they set off. Now the Jews historically had counted 3 watches to the night. 3 watches. Rome had 4. So what they had done, the Jews being, of course, under Roman rule, had accepted the 4 watches per night. Now that was a way of keeping time during the night. And they were 2 hours to a watch. So what that means is they were out, left about 6 o'clock, so it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. They had been rowing for 6 hours, right? 6 hours. No, 9 hours, I'm sorry. 9 hours. They've been rowing for 9 hours. 6 to 12, yeah, that's 9 hours. The fourth watch. The lake is about 7 miles across. John tells us they went 3 to 4 miles in 9 hours. That's a lot of rowing. A lot of rowing. I remember one time my dad and I were out, we had a 20-foot wooden cruiser fishing boat thing back when I was a teenager, and we were out on the Sound out by Hat Island out by Mukilteo, and the waves started getting high and the motor quit. And we had a little trolling motor. We fired that little trolling motor up and tried to get in with that. It was a little 5 horsepower, you know. And all it was doing was keeping us from going out to any further. So we had these big long oars on board. So my dad and I were out there rowing this boat. And we weren't that far offshore. I mean, Hat Island out there at Mukilteo was, I don't know if it's even a mile offshore. But it took us over 2.5 hours to get that boat in because the tide was going out and the wind was hitting on us. And when we got in, they said, we didn't think you guys were going to make it. We were about ready to send a boat out there to pull you in. We got that boat in. But it took a long time to go that little distance. And this was not a big wind. It was more just the tide going out, and there was some headwind. So I can kind of relate to what these guys are going through. They've made it halfway across the lake. They've been there for 9 hours. They have got to be dead tired. And they're not making any more headway. And they're afraid. These are fishermen. They know what happens, you know. Now to me, of course, being the person I am, I'd have turned the boat around. I'd be headed back, let the wind push me. Ooh, put the sails up, let's go. A couple of things I want you to notice here. On the way over on the lake, you remember, it says a storm came up. And Jesus was sleeping in the boat. It didn't say it was just a wind, it was a storm. So I picture the difference. You know, you got a hurricane going, there's thunder and lightning and rain pouring down in buckets, and the boat is filling up with water. You can see the disciples, and they're all frantically trying to bail out, and they go up and they wake up Jesus, and he stands up and says, "What's the matter with you? Knock it off!" And the whole thing stops, and everything speeds. And they say, wow, even the sea and the nature, even they respond to this prophet. You know, you would think, wow, you know, that's really something. But you know, Elijah, he called fire down out of heaven, and he was just a prophet. Moses, he opened up the Red Sea, and he was just a prophet. And of course, then you had, you know, here's all of Israel lined up on the Jordan River. And along comes Joshua, and he opened the Jordan River, and he wasn't even a prophet. So the fact that men could control nature, you know, through God through them, was not a new thing to them. This was not an oh wow moment, how powerful he is. They wondered at him, but all it told them was he was a mighty prophet. And then they get over to the other side, and here's 5,000 people that need to be fed, and he feeds the 5,000. Wow, that's fantastic. However, Elijah took the little widow woman and made the barrel of meal and the cruse of oil and never ran out. You see, these things had happened before to prophets. It wasn't something new. There were miracles, miraculous things that happened all through the whole history of Israel when prophets were on the scene. And so here they were, out in the sea, wondering if they're going to make it across, dead tired, and they look up, and what do they see? Here comes Jesus. Now, I don't think he was just floating through the air, you know. But I'll tell you what, he was moving faster than they were. They were stuck at 3 to 4 miles, and he's just walking along. The wind's blowing in his face. His hair's probably standing out behind him. All of his clothes are being blown around, you know, and he's just walking along. And Mark tells us he would have passed them. He would have kept going. But they cried out in fear. You see, he knew the situation when he was on the mountain. He waited until they were in sheer terror out there in the middle of the lake. He waited until there was no possible way that they could get escaped. They were at their lowest point. And then he decided, well, I guess I'll walk out there. And so he just walks on the water. Now, you know, this was not a calm lake. When you get this kind of a wind that you can't even roll again, you got these big rollers coming at you, and they're crashing over the front of the boat from the wind. Might have been a clear night. And in fact, it maybe and very possibly was a clear night. How else would they see him? And he's walking along over the rollers, and you know, they're going up, and they say, "There, what's happening?" They go down, and the next one come up, "Oh, what's that there? Hey, he's still there. He's still walking. Oh, look, he's almost to us. Oh, it's a ghost." And the words here is they were terrified. I mean, they were afraid. And they began to cry out. Now, they were not crying out to Jesus. I think this is key. They were crying out of their despair. When men cry out from their despair, Jesus hears them. We often limit what God hears to the fact they have to address Him first. We think people who are in trouble have to say, Jesus, I'm calling on you, I'm in trouble. God responds when we acknowledge that we have reached a point where we can do nothing. And when we reach that point, and when we cry out at that point, God will intervene. And when they reached that point, here came Jesus. He knew all about it, but He waited until they had reached that point. And then He terrified them even more, walking on the water. But when they cried out, He's walking along. When they cried out, He looks over and says, oh, that's all right, it's just me. Don't be afraid, it's just me. I'm just taking a stroll. Told you I'd meet you, it's just me, I'm here. You know, that's kind of humorous, but when you think about it, isn't that kind of what Jesus did? I don't think He got up there and, all right, be not afraid, for it is I. I don't think so. That's not the nature of Jesus. I think Jesus was laughing. I don't think he was a serene, kind of a guy at all. I think he was very, very open because people liked him. And I think he's what? Hey guys, what do you feel afraid? Don't be afraid. It's just me. It's I. I'm here. I'm here. Now, what happens next? Only Matthew covers this, and I find that kind of interesting that Mark doesn't cover it, and Luke doesn't write anything about the incidents, and John doesn't cover it either. But here's Peter. Now, remember, Matthew is looking at it from the Jewish perspective of works, and so here's Peter. And we've often said how much faith Peter had. Which, of course, he had more than the rest of them. I mean, they stayed in the boat. But I want you to notice a couple of things here. Verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. They're out there in the boat, the wind's blowing, they're not going anywhere, they're dead tired, they think they're going to be swamped and sunk at any minute, and He says, be of good cheer, be happy. He's maybe even laughing, you know. He may even be kind of chuckling, you know. Hey guys, be of good cheer. It's me, I'm here. And notice Peter, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you. Peter did not respond to the voice of God and said, oh, it's Jesus, hey, we're all saved. He said, if it's you, give me a sign. That's what he's saying. If it's you, show us a sign. Now, I think I would have found a different sign if I was Peter. But notice this, he says, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He didn't say, let me come to you. He didn't say, Jesus, if it's you, I'm going to come to you and you keep me from sinking. No. He said, if it is you, command me. You see, Peter didn't want to make the commitment. He wanted Jesus to make the command. If there was one thing that Peter learned in following Jesus, is that Jesus, He was not a mamby-pamby. When it come to casting out demons, he just said, come out. Boom, they were done. It was done. If somebody needed to be healed, he said, be healed. They were healed. It was at the command of Jesus that miracles took place. And so Peter said, command a miracle. I want to come walking to you on the water. Command me. It'll be done because it is a commandment. And whatever you command has to happen. You see, we do that to God all the time. We say, God commands somebody to be healed. Now, we may not use those same words. We pray for somebody, you know, we're praying for them. And what we're expecting is for God to make the commandment, and it's going to happen automatically. Because everything Jesus commanded happened. Right? This word specifically means to command, to take authority and command. But we are not told to wait for God to command things for us. We need to make the commitment, and we need to step out on our own. Faith is not saying God commanded it's going to happen. Faith says God commanded and I will receive it. You see the difference? If I'm a cop out there and I tell you to stop and you don't stop, you're going to get in trouble. But if he stands out there, if I'm out there, I'm not a cop, and I say stop, and you stop, it's because you willingly stopped. Not because you're going to get in trouble if you don't. That's kind of the idea here. Peter wanted a sign. Peter wanted to get out of the boat. He was rambunctious and always was. He wanted to get out of the boat and, yeah, Jesus can do it, I can do it. But you got to command it before I'm going to get out of this boat. And Jesus, he just says, okay, come on. He didn't say I command, he just said come. And Peter got out of the boat and he was walking on the water to Jesus. Now, I don't know how far Jesus was away, but he was close enough or far enough, however you look at it, that Peter got almost to Jesus, within arm's reach. And I want you to notice, he didn't look at the water. He didn't look at what he was standing on. What does it say? When he saw that the wind was boisterous. You know, when the wind really blows, and I happened to be cruising the channels last night, and there was a deal on tornadoes and windstorms and natural disaster things, you know. And they were showing this windstorm that hit, I think it was Vietnam. And it just happened to be a camera, I guess a security camera. It was set up looking down the street, and it was in a city in Vietnam, and it was in one of the third world country streets. You know, it's not like our streets, old tin roofs and things, you know. And the people are out there walking around selling things, and all of a sudden the wind starts blowing, and pretty soon some things start coming across. And then all of a sudden this wind hits, and there's this guy on a motor scooter, and he's going down the street, and he's dodging all this stuff flying across the street, and he's doing really well till the wind hit him. And boom, over on the side he goes. And he jumps up and runs down the street, and he's trying to run, and he's running like this. That wind is blowing, everything is swirling, chaotic. Well, what about out on the sea? Peter got out of the boat. It wasn't that he was walking on the water, and the preacher said, well, he looked down and saw the water. No, he didn't see the water. The water wasn't what was bothering him. It was the wind. It was the fact that in order to get to Jesus, he had to fight the wind. He had to fight to stand up. Now Jesus, he's just standing there, and here I can see Peter. You know, he's walking and he's like this, and he's trying to get to Jesus, and the wind is blowing, and he's taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. When he saw that the wind was boisterous, we want to rely upon Jesus, and we're willing to get into things. You know, God, make me a missionary. Commanded God that I be a missionary. Okay. God says, okay, you're a missionary. So you get out of the boat and you're over there being a missionary. But all of a sudden it's the wind that discourages you. It's not where you're standing. You're where you wanted to be. You're on the sea. You're walking, you know. He said, come to you on the water. That's what he wanted to do. But when he got there and he found the winds, the boisterous winds that he was fighting against, that he had to toil against to get through it, what happened? He began to sink. Not because he was afraid of the water. It's that he couldn't stand up against the forces that were holding him back. We fall and fail not because of where we are, it's because of the winds of oppression and the forces that come against us, and we have the faith to go where God tells us to go, but we don't have the faith to move forward. And Jesus' response was that he immediately stretched out his hand and caught him and said, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" There were two parts to Peter's question or request. The first one was, let me come to you. And the second one was walking on the water. It's amazing, he got the walking on the water fine. It was the coming that he failed out on. See, Jesus was strong enough to keep you from sinking, but he wasn't strong enough to help you get through the wind. When we stand up against opposition, when there are things that come against us, and the trials and tribulations of this world, and all of the pressure starts to build up on us, it's hard to say, God will take me through. It's easy to say, oh yeah, God's called me to this church. Oh yeah, God's called me to this position. Yes, God wants me in this job. Yes, I believe I'm here. It's miraculous, but I'm here. But as soon as we get into that opposition, it's hard to press through that, to get through that so that we can get to Jesus. Now, Jesus is merciful. He could have stood there and said, okay, you wanted it, I commanded it, you want to come, I'm here, come get me. Oh, you're sinking. Well, build up your faith. And there are a lot of people that do that with other people, isn't it? Well, if you're going to sink, you better get more faith, or there's sharks down there. There's fish down there that'll eat you. Come get you. I'm safe over here. Come over here. But it says, as soon as he began to sink, Jesus stretched out his hand. He will come to our rescue, even when we are of little faith. Now, Peter got his faith straightened out. It took a while. Think about the crucifixion when he denied Christ. This was the thing with Peter. He was willing to get going, but when opposition came, he had a problem. And later on, after he was a disciple and an apostle and was out preaching, what did Paul call Peter on? He said, Peter, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm reading, Peter, you're not standing up to the Jewish law, and you should be. You should not be requiring Gentiles to be circumcised. That's not according to what Jesus taught. What was that whole thing about? Peter was being forced. He was being pushed. He was opposition from the Jewish rulers and those that he do that. And we see Peter, even when he opened to the Gentiles. Peter, who opened the gospel to the Gentiles. You remember he had to be up on the house and had to see the vision of the bed sheet with all of the foul stuff in it that he was supposed to eat. You know, I can't touch that stuff. It was all symbolic of the Gentile. He still had to be convinced because of the pressure of the Jewish leadership. But that was the nature of Peter. And yet look at how mighty Peter's works were. So we can learn from that. We don't have to have perfect faith in order for God to use us. We sometimes get that impression. I don't have enough faith to do that. Step out of the boat. And don't worry about where you're stepping in. Start worrying about the oppression. Building your faith to stand against those that would stand against you, or those things that would come against you, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're people suing and all this kind of stuff that happens in our lives. And oh, you know, what am I going to do? Very simple. What you did in the first place, cry out to Jesus. All right. Notice this, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Now coming over in the storm, Jesus was already in the boat, and they had a storm going on, and being in the boat didn't seem to make any difference. But this time, as soon as he got into the boat, it doesn't say he said anything. He just got in the boat, and as soon as he got in the boat, everything ceased. When Jesus gets in your boat, all of your trials, all of your tribulations, all of your problems, they're not going to cease necessarily, but what's hindering you will cease. And you can make headway. But you have to have Jesus in the boat. That's the key, is Jesus in your boat. That's a good sermon topic, Jesus in your boat. Notice what Mark says. Then he, being Jesus, went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled. They were awestruck. Oh. Something happened. They were just emotionally drained at what they had seen. Awestruck. Oh. Why were they so awestruck? John says, then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. That little sentence right at the end of John's commentary on this explains a lot. Matthew doesn't mention it, Mark doesn't mention it, but Matthew does. Or John does, I'm sorry. John does. The walking on the water was miraculous. The stopping of the wind was miraculous. They had already seen Jesus stop the wind. Did that really, really? Come on, Jesus, you stopped a storm before, and you just shut the wind down here. That part was not as miraculous as the stopping of the storm. So what was different? It was because they immediately traveled 3 to 4 miles in a split second. That's what it says. I mean, you can argue back and forth about this. And by the way, I don't see any commentaries that even deal with that sentence, that scripture. They won't even talk about it. They just quote it and walk off. They don't even want to deal with it. And immediately, that means immediately. That means immediately. It doesn't mean in 5 minutes or 5 hours or 2 hours. Immediately, when he stepped in the boat, they were on land. Jesus miraculously transported a boat with 13 people in it, 3.5 miles in a split second, and set it on land. Probably at a dock, and I don't think because they'd had to push it back in the water, that wouldn't make sense. That's why they marveled beyond measure. Jesus basically had done miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle, and it had not affected them like this. Jesus not only proved himself to be the master of nature, calming the storm, feeding and breaking bread and making it feed 5,000, healing, casting out demons. He could even walk on water. Whoa. But when he controlled time, when he was able to make distances disappear in a flash, there was no earthly explanation for what he did. Wow. You know, Star Trek, they don't have anything on what Jesus can do. Verse 52 of Mark. They marveled beyond, they amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. Wait a minute. What does this have to do with the loaves? Now, he didn't mention the fishes. It's just the loaves. Wonder why that is. Jesus is going to take that next week. We're going to talk about his teachings about the bread of life. When he broke that bread, 5,000 people, 10,000, 12,000, whatever many were there, 5,000 men. When he took those loaves and he blessed them and he broke them, and then he gave them to his disciples, and they were able to break them and hand them out. What they failed to realize was this was an example of something far greater than walking on the sea, far greater than stopping the wind, far greater than healing or casting out demons, or just anything he had done. There was an example here to these men of what was going to take place, not only of Jesus, but of them. The key is he blessed the bread. Anything that is blessed of Jesus can be multiplied. They went out on their way. They just got back from practice runs in which they were able to do miracles and do things. And they taught, but they didn't understand what they were teaching. When they saw Jesus take command of time and location, transport them miraculously from the middle of the sea to land, while the wind stopped, they should not have been marveling at that. Because if they had understood what Jesus was teaching them, we're in the period of teaching the disciples. What was he trying to get them to understand? That he was God. And when he blesses the Word, and we'll find out later his body, what that example was about. When his body was broken, it was up to them to take that broken body and distribute it to men. You see? Not transubstantiation that the Catholic Church teaches, or co-substantiation as the Lutherans teach. No. But the gospel. The gospel is Jesus Christ. We limit the gospel. You know, we say it's the good news about Jesus. Well, it's that too. But the true, pure gospel is Jesus Christ. He is the good news. Not just for salvation, but for anything we need. He is the good news.
Yes.
He will provide. How does he do it? Through his servants. That was a tremendous lesson to them. And yet they seem to have just blown it off. Oh, look! I've got a basket full of food. I'm hungry. Let's go sit in the boat. Maybe that's what they were doing, waiting for Jesus. They were down there eating. Oh, boy. He provided for me. Look at this. And never stopped to connect the fact that before they were provided for, they first had to provide for others. There was a lesson on the sea, Walker. It wasn't just the lesson that Jesus had power. But it's interesting to note that after this, we are going to find the disciples for the first time, verse 33 of Matthew. Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." What were they saying? You're not just a Messiah, because they already thought he was that. You're not just a prophet. You're not just a great man, a great teacher. You are divine. Wow. It took them a while to connect all of the dots. But I thoroughly believe that when Jesus got in that boat, they understood the 5,000, the 5 loaves of bread. It took root, and it grew from there. All right. I told you we'd be done early tonight, so we are. Any questions? I don't think I'd be done quite this early, but not this long. All right, next week we're going to pick up with the Jesus teaching on the bread of life. And we'll find that teaching becomes the great divide between those who truly want to follow him and those who wanted to follow him to get what they could get. And we'll look at that next week. No questions, comments? Nothing?
Good. Good as always.
Okay.